Hello, and welcome to R&R's Ask the Expert. I'm your host, Valerie King, R&R's editor-in-chief. I'm joined today by Wayne Lawrence, managing partner at Aska Blast Great Lakes, which is located in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Aska is a manufacturer and distributor of media blasting equipment and supplies, offering both a proprietary line of lightweight aluminum blast pots and more traditional blast systems, including dry ice, baking soda, glass, walnut shell, and other eco friendly options. In addition to Michigan, Aska has locations in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. Now, Wayne has more than 25 years of media blasting knowledge and experience, which is why we brought him on. He's also contributed several times in the past to R&R. So we're going to catch up on the role of media blasting and restoration and key things restoration contractors should know as they invest in these tools and put them to work. Thank you so much for joining me, Wayne.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yes, certainly a pleasure. Okay, so can you begin with, I guess, an overview of your background in media blasting and your relationship with the restoration industry in terms of media blasting?
Okay. Well, sure. I've been selling media blasting equipment for over 25 years. And 25 years ago, when I first got started, I was really unsure where I was going to sell everything that eventually my business turned into. And as far as a relationship with the restoration industry, it just turns out that I started to specialize in blasting techniques that were in themselves applicable to the restoration trade. Smoke and fire damage, for instance, there's a natural progression from cleaning by hand with brushes and sanding to cleaning in more advanced ways, such as blasting and removing things from building materials at a much faster rate than what can be accomplished by hand. And of course, in many fire losses, you're looking at large losses, tens of thousands of square feet sometimes of material that is just soot covered. There's a couple good examples that come to mind, but I'm sure we'll get into the meat of this shortly. But blasting and restoration are just linked in such a way because it's a very valuable tool.
Thank you so much for that. All right, another layer here, similar question, but broadening it. Can you share a bit more about Eska and what the company offers in its relationship with the restoration industry?
Well, as I said, the blasting is a tool, and as a tool that can be applied in many different ways. And there are a lot of other distributors of blasting equipment out there that do a very good job, let's say, in the industrial market, for instance, aerospace or medical or some specialized applications. Restoration is just a specialized application of a tool. And so, as such, what we have at ESCA is we have environmentally sensible chemical alternatives to things like chemical stripping or other types of chemical applications. And again, I mentioned the manual applications like scrubbing and sanding with sanding brushes or sandpaper. Those types of things are, again, they're tools, but ESCA offers tools that are specific to the restoration trade, things like dry ice blasting, things that are specific for cleaning graffiti, cleaning monuments, cleaning historical things, historical documents, historical buildings, historical features in landmarks and in all different types of applications that have to do with restoration. It's simply a matter of having that right tool and having the understanding how to apply it. So again, baking soda, corn cob, walnut shell, dry ice, plastic media, lasers, there's all different applications for these tools. And ESCA just has an understanding of that market, that reason for using it, and that allows us to have the right equipment when the customer calls.
Very helpful. I feel like you've done a good job of this already, but just to make sure we're super clear, for those of us who aren't quite sure what media blasting is in the
Sure.
restoration industry, what is it high level? It sounds like it's an alternative to much slower options to clean things, but let us
Yeah.
know.
Well, a lot of people use the term sandblasting, and in fact, you'll hear us use that term every once in a while, either out of laziness or on purpose, because there are people that do still sandblast, and that means using silica sand as a blasting media. We've coined the term media blasting to more accurately represent the fact that it's not just sand. There are other materials that are in use. Now, the industry still uses sandblasting to describe things like glass bead blasting. Well, glass bead blasting is not sand, but you could still call it sandblasting and people understand what you mean. So it's media blasting because there are many different media. In fact, silica sand is one of those media that we don't even recommend anymore because of its health concerns. Silicosis is a big concern with the breathing of silica dust. So going back to your question, one of the things I can say is that as an industry, the application of media or blasting with some type of media that becomes a cleaning mechanism, a tool. And it's a very powerful tool because, again, as you can imagine, as you're blasting with sand, the particles of material or baking soda, whatever the media is that you're blasting with, becomes the tool. And it can clean the surface very effectively by using compressed air to propel that media against the surface and give you a new, fresh, or clean surface.
Thank you for that media blasting 101 high level. Much
Yeah,
appreciated.
right.
Okay, so you sort of already did this too, but making sure we get the whole shebang. Can you
Mhm.
provide, I guess, a highlight reel of sort of the types of different media blasting tools, like maybe behind that media, and approaches that are most relevant to the restoration industry?
Okay. Well, a lot of that has to do with the type of cleaning you're trying to do. So if somebody has a smoke and fire damage restoration project, that's going to lead towards certain types of media. And the type of media, whether it be, let's just use dry ice and baking soda as an example, because those are two that immediately come to mind, but they rely on completely different styles of equipment to be applied. So an ice blasting machine typically blasts with dry ice, and that's all it does. A baking soda blasting machine is more specifically designed to blast with baking soda. So the tool that you use to apply a certain process is often very closely related to the media itself. Dry ice and baking soda are, again, a good example of very what's the word I'm looking for? Very unique media. They're not like sand in a lot of ways. If you look at a lot of blasting techniques or processes, what you'll find is that they use materials that are very similar to sand, although they're not silica, right? So baking soda and dry ice don't really fit that same mold. Yeah, they're like sand in a certain way in that they're particles that blast through a system, but they are very unique in the fact that they don't necessarily flow and react inside of equipment like sand does. And then also, baking soda and dry ice are higher in cost than a lot of other alternative media might be, the more traditional sandblasting medium. So the cost of these media, baking soda and dry ice in this example, are more expensive. So they need equipment that is conservative or doesn't throw too much, because if you throw too much baking soda or you throw too much dry ice, you run into a lack of efficiency where it becomes too expensive to apply the process because of the media cost. So with baking soda, for instance, you want to see blast flow rates of a pound or less per minute sometimes. With dry ice, you want to see flow rates not to exceed two, maybe 2.5 pounds per minute. You start to exceed those numbers, and again, bad things happen. The cost goes way up. And in the case of, say, baking soda or other media that's expensive, you end up with wasted material just laying on the floor. And that has to be cleaned up, that has to be attended to, and again, it just lacks, it becomes a lack of efficiency based on the poor style of equipment that's chosen. So choosing the right machine is important once you recognize what process you're going to be going into.
Very helpful. Thanks, Wayne. We've got a
Mhm.
background in the media itself, the tools that are blasting it,
Yeah.
So now I'd like to take it a layer deeper
Yeah.
and refer back to a 2011 article that you wrote for R&R in which you wrote,
Okay.
understand the application and you understand blasting, noting that you find it best to use examples of applications to help answer common questions that restorers have, like when to apply blasting, what solutions call for which blast media, etc.
Right.
So, could you perhaps share a few? I know we don't have 30 hours here and you could probably offer so many, but could you offer just a few application examples that highlight for us which scenarios restoration contractors might apply respective media blasting approaches to?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. It's a really broad question that leaves. I can answer this in a number of different ways, but the answer is that the again, you've already said that the process dictates what you're trying to do dictates the process you'll use to get there. So the blasting process, a good example of different process would be blasting of stone. um, Blasting of stone, masonry, brick and mortar, that's been fire damaged. Fire damaged brick and stone is a good way to differentiate some of these processes, like baking soda, for instance. Baking soda is a very good process for using to clean smoke and fire damage because it removes it very well, but it also has a deodorizing function that goes along with it. So in many cases, when you're blasting with baking soda, not only are you cleaning the surface, but you're actually infiltrating the structure with baking soda dust. And that dust coming in contact with soot particles changes the pH, neutralizes the odor, and changes the smelliness. The negative aspect of a fire loss a lot of times has to do with the smell as well as the look. But when you're talking about masonry, one of the things that you can really focus on is how well does that media clean the surface. And baking soda is a very, very fine particulate. Let's just call it 260 micron size particles. So very small particles, uh, millions of them striking the surface and getting little knife-like edges of crystalline baking soda to scratch at the surface at a microscopic level from many different angles with, just as I said, millions of particles just striking the surface and cleaning in a way that can't be done in with other media. And one of the things with baking soda is that it's breaking down as it's hitting the surface. So it's soft as well as crystalline, so that it breaks apart into small particles, dust, and doesn't impact the surface or change the structure of the surface. With brick and mortar, that's important because you want to maintain that surface because you're not replacing it. You're simply cleaning it to be left in place most times.
Very helpful.
Oh,
I'm learned a lot about that deodorization aspect too of media blasting, which is intriguing.
right.
Oh, okay. So I guess aside from the when to apply blasting and what
Mhm.
approaches fit with what applications questions, I'm sure you get a ton. Are there any
Uh-huh.
other common questions that you get from the restoration industry on media blasting, and whether it's one or a few common questions and what the answers to those questions are?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that I get all the time is, should we use baking soda? Should we use dry ice? Or does it matter? And I think it's very important to understand that there are differences between the two processes, and that it's important to choose the right one in the right situation. So that's an area where I think it's important to understand what you're asking, and that's um, when to apply blasting and when to what differentiates. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Okay. So if you're talking about, again, differentiating between the processes, it's important to understand with things like brick and mortar that there's that natural cleaning ability of a small crystalline particle like baking soda versus a larger particle like we see with dry ice. Dry ice is typically applied in a pellet form, and a pellet form is much, much larger than the crystalline baking soda is in its particle size. A example is in a handful of baking soda, you would work almost a lifetime, I think, trying to count the number of particles in a handful of baking soda. But in a handful of dry ice pellets, you could easily count that. Throw it on the desk, separate the particles out and make a count. You can do that. But from a microscopic level, when those large pellets hit the surface, they don't have the same cleaning ability on that microstructure of brick and mortar or stone, or even sometimes things like wood. So baking soda is different in that respect. Now, there may be surfaces, again, wood might be one of them, where you might find that the soot removal properties of dry ice are equal to the soot removal properties of baking soda, or similar, in fact. But again, you've got to look at the differences between those two processes and the differences between what you're trying to accomplish. Are you working mainly on brick and mortar? Are you working on wood? Is it a combination of the two? What particle is best for cleaning what you're trying to get after?
Thank you for that.
Mhm.
Okay, now I'm excited to get into some real life examples, which you actually have shared a number of intriguing and insightful media blasting case studies with R&R
Right,
over the years in your writing.
right.
So first off, what would you say is the most innovative and or impressive project that comes to mind?
Well, impressive process or impressive projects are fun to look at, and I can look back at several projects that immediately come to mind as those projects that are fun to work on. Well, after 25 years of blasting, a crawl space or blasting an attic, when a bright orange statue built by a world-renowned sculptor is in front of you, and that's what the blasting project is for the day, that sticks in your head. That sticks out amongst the rest. So, there was, and I think it was featured in one of the last articles I wrote, a statue called Aria. And that statue is at Frederick Meyer Gardens here in West Michigan, and it's a world renowned sculptor that built that, and it was commissioned by that sculpture park. It's impressive, and you just can't look at that project and not think, wow, that was really fun. That project was where we were trying to remove a clear coat from the surface so that it could be reapplied. It was a failed coating, and the coatings manufacturer, along with the paint contractor that did the painting, were involved with the stripping of that statue so that it could be reapplied and last into the future. Where I live here in West Michigan, we also have a Calder mobile. I'm sorry, stabile. It doesn't move. It's in one position. But Alexander Calder built this back in the 60s and into the early 70s, and this was a major advancement for our town where we live. And so that's been blasted on a couple of different occasions to take it back to bare metal and reapply the original paint color that makes it so outstanding. And it's a beautiful bright orange color that it just really sets off, the downtown plaza where it resides. So those are two that come to mind, but we do projects every day that are unique. I just came back from a large Catholic church in central Indiana that was damaged by a fire. And they were able to, because of their advanced firefighting and fire detection equipment, laser equipment, they were able to detect the fire quickly, get the fire put out, and it's still a $2 million loss that needs to be attended to, but it's not a $50 million loss where the thing burned to the ground. So that process is going to be removing soot from the surface of plaster, which was applied over lath. So a lath and plaster construction inside of a domed or vaulted ceiling, as well as walls that are 30 feet tall. So just a really unique process that the contractor reaches out and says, what can we do? And when you have an answer, it's extremely satisfying to bring something like that to from beginning of this terrible loss to what will eventually be a celebration, I'm sure, when they move back into the church again.
Very cool stories. Thanks for
Yeah.
sharing those.
Yeah.
All right, so now I have sort of the opposite question. Is there a restoration project that utilized media blasting you've come across that might serve as an example to our listeners of what not to do?
Okay. That's a good question. Obviously, we all know what we're doing because we've made mistakes. So, we do what we do so well because we've all been there and done the wrong thing. And I think I think one of the things that I see fairly often, um, I think back to a job that I did not too long ago, but a contractor called and he had used baking soda blasting for a long time and was cleaning in a structure. And this structure was going to allow him, because of the revenue that it was going to provide, was going to allow him to buy a relatively expensive piece of equipment, a dry ice blaster. So his comment was, I think I'm finally going to get to buy that dry ice blaster because of this job. Why don't you bring one out and blast with it on this job? And if it works well, we'll keep it and we'll buy it. And I started asking him what the job was about. What was he doing? And it had to do, again, going back to that brick and mortar. This one was a stone application, a stone chimney and a stone fireplace and mantle. The stone, dry ice does not do a great job of cleaning stone and masonry when it comes to soot, because of again, going back to that particle size and the microstructure of the surface and some of the other factors that come into play. Baking soda just does a tremendous job on that application, where dry ice can leave you with a gray type surface as opposed to a clean surface on white stone in particular, that this job was. And so I brought the dry ice blaster, but I told him to make sure that he had his soda blaster on the job site that same day. And we did the demonstration with the dry ice, and immediately next to it, we did the demonstration with the baking soda. And it was clear that the baking soda cleaned much more effectively on this white stone than the dry ice could. And that was just kind of a learning experience for that contractor. It was something I already knew, but it came from a failure. And that failure was recommending or assuming that all of these blast media are the same. And when you start to assume that one tool is the same as the next tool is the same as the next tool, it's like trying to fix a Swiss watch with a monkey wrench. It doesn't work. You have to have the right tools to do the right job. And sometimes that means, understanding what tool is right
So
and wrong
helpful.
and wrong. Yeah.
Right, right. These teachable moments. I appreciate that example.
Mhm.
All right. So, thinking broader again and looking to the future, are there any notable advancements in media blasting for property restoration, whether it's, equipment, the ways it's being used, any of that that sticks out, any trends, or is it pretty status quo for the moment, for the time
Yeah.
being?
Well, sandblasting is, an industry that's been around for a while. And, I don't want to say we've learned everything because we certainly haven't. But to say, has there been major advancements in the last 5 to 10 years? Yeah, there's been advancements. And a lot of that is reaction, is in reaction to different factors in the market. For instance, we're seeing a major upswing. Oh, sorry. We're seeing a major upswing in things like wet vapor blasting. Well, wet vapor blasting is the utilization of wet media as opposed to dry media to control dust. In many areas of the country, you'll find that particulate or dust emanating from a job site are things that are just not acceptable in today's world. We understand that particulate, whether it come from farming practices or construction practices, or in this particular case, blasting, dust emanating from a job site is not an acceptable. It's not the way we do it in this world today. Why? Well, because I don't want to breathe their dust, and neither does anyone else. So you have to protect the public at large from dust. And so dustless or vapor blasting, or using blasting that doesn't have dust associated with it, is very important. And so that's become much more popular in the last few years, simply because of that dust-free nature of the process. Now, it does use water as part of the process, so it's not always an answer for every application, but it is a new tool in the toolbox that is something to consider when you're looking for the right tool. So that's been an advancement that has been really popular. And I think one of the things we also see is we see advancements in different media, whether it be a different way of processing the media, or in the case of like baking soda, for instance, there are baking soda that we sell that have flow agents added to them that allow the use of baking soda in situations where it might not be possible otherwise. Um, we use in this trade, we use a lot of portable diesel air compressors, and they produce a wet, dirty air stream when you compare it to a refrigerated dry air that you might find in a manufacturing facility. So out in the field, we see a lot different conditions, and having a media that it flows under these damp conditions can be really important. So just having an additive in the baking soda that is, again, regarded as safe, but having that additive in there that can resist moisture makes that process utilize more usable by more people and in more situations.
So, as a restorer, if I'm considering investing in new media blasting technology, before I make that purchase, whether it's because I'm replacing existing equipment or because I'm thinking of expanding and diversifying my media blasting offerings, what are some considerations I should be making before I make any media blasting investments? Maybe what are some questions I should be asking myself or someone like you?
That's a good question, and you know, I have answers, of course, and one of the answers that immediately comes to mind is, who are you dealing with? Who are you buying from? Make sure that you're buying from somebody that you trust, and that you value their experience and their input. So I think who you buy from makes a difference. Training is one of the things that goes along with that. We've always offered training with our equipment. So one of the things I don't have to worry about is that they misapplied the process. Because if we go there and we do the startup training when they buy the equipment, that's so important to getting somebody started on the right foot, is to have that relationship with that customer, and not just the owner, because in the restoration field, I'll deal with the owner of a restoration company, and he'll buy the equipment. He or she will buy the equipment from me. And that's great. We form a relationship. We start to understand each other. But what's also important is that there's other people in that organization, technicians, project managers, estimators, people that will need to apply that process, that will need to know me as well. And so having that initial startup training has been so important for me. You asked earlier on, how did I develop a relationship with the restoration industry? And this kind of brings that full circle back to that same question, is that it's the training. It's not so much that I have the best piece of equipment in the world to sell. I think I do most of the time, but we also have that understanding that teaching the customer how to apply the machine, how to apply the process, is as important as having the right piece of equipment. So that startup training and assistance at the beginning really gets them moving in the right direction. And I think it's important that I would say that I wouldn't buy a piece of blasting equipment if it didn't come with training, if it didn't come with some type of knowledge behind it that would allow me to use this process effectively. And again, over 25 years, I personally have just developed that mental attitude that I'm going to insist on training almost every time, so that people understand how to use it, apply it correctly, and then don't fail because they misapplied. They might fail for some other reason, but they're not going to fail because they didn't do it right.
All right, last but not least, anything I didn't ask you about media blasting as it relates to restoration that you would like to cover off on?
Well, I'd really like to kind of just touch on a few budget questions, because I
Hmm.
can guarantee you that if anybody out there is watching this, which I'm sure they will, they're going to ask the same question as well. The question that I get, almost every single person that calls wants to know, how much does it cost? And so, to avoid that question or to not answer that question in this conversation would be difficult, right? For me, I think it's important that we understand that there are costs associated with this equipment. So let's start out with the fact that this equipment can be rented. So again, some of the same stipulations go into renting as they do in purchasing. Make sure you're working with somebody who knows the process. If they have to bring the machine in from 3 states away and then ask somebody else every time a question is asked of them, that might not be your best source for rental. But again, going back to what we do, we have rentals available, and they can be rented very affordably and used on jobs as the jobs come up. Now, many contractors would prefer to buy and not rent equipment. So the cost of equipment to purchase can be a little bit daunting to somebody who's just getting started into the restoration field or just getting started with blasting. So renting is a good way to actually experience the process and to get an idea of what works and what doesn't work, what works for your people, what doesn't work for your people, and so forth. So renting is a way to mitigate that initial upfront cost. But if you're going to invest in blasting, expect to spend somewhere between $8,000 and $10,000 for a good soda blasting machine. Expect to spend somewhere between $20,000 and $25,000 for a good dry ice blasting machine. Multimedia blasting machines that run things like walnut shell, corn cob, and those more closely related to traditional sandblasting machines, you're going to spend somewhere between, let's call it, $5,000 and $7,000 for the equipment. Now, these prices are exclusive or do not include an air compressor. So an air compressor is an integral part of what we're talking about today. So blasting requires air and lots of it. And so again, diesel tow behind air compressors are normal, standard stuff. Do you buy one? Again, most people that are in the restoration business to begin with blasting don't buy an air compressor. They're rented. They're very pervasive. You can find them in many places, and you can actually get a pretty good deal on a rental air compressor for the few days that you might need it every 2-3 months for a restoration job. But an air compressor for the size that we're talking about is going to cost somewhere between $20,000 and $25,000. But again, about 9 out of 10 of my customers don't buy air compressors, at least initially. Maybe later on they invest in an air compressor, but again, that's after a long period of learning what's necessary, learning what works best for them, and I guess justifying the cost of a $20,000 air compressor. So I think those are things to think about, is that rental is important, purchasing the right piece of equipment is important, and understanding that the air compressor is an integral part of what you're doing, but not necessarily something that's important to purchase right up front. Those, I think, are good
Wow.
things.
Very good. Thank you so much for unpacking pricing, buying
Yeah.
versus renting. Because,
Mhm.
yeah, to your point, what more important question? Well, not more important, but as important as many other questions is there, which is what is this going to cost me? Should I buy this? Where do I
Yeah.
go? Awesome. All right.
Yeah.
This has been so great. Thank you very much, Wayne.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank
All
you so
right.
much for
Yeah.
having me. I appreciate it a lot.
Oh gosh, so excited to have you and share this with the world. All right, before we go, one final question, and that is where can our listeners go to connect with you or learn more about Eska Blast?
Okay. Well, I always love to get phone calls. I'm an old-fashioned guy, so call me on the phone, area code 317-442-3507. That's a great way to reach me. If you're a little bit more modern and you want to use email, that's a great way to reach me as well. And I can be reached at wayne@eskablast.com. That's WAYNE at ESCABLAST.com. You can also visit our website, which is www.escablast.com.
That was perfect. All right. Well, listeners and viewers, for more insights on restoration, remediation, and the people behind it all, visit our website, randrmagonline.com, Apple, or Spotify. If you haven't yet, be sure to follow the podcast to keep up with our latest episodes and give us a quick review and rating. We're also on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, so we invite you to follow us there too. This has been R&R's Ask the Expert. Thank you for listening.